The fearsome billionaire saw a mother crying at the gate. His next move left everyone speechless. Chapter 1. The Ruthless Reputation. Marcus Blackstone was a name that struck fear into the hearts of Wall Street executives and boardroom veterans across America. At 58, he had built a business empire worth $4 billion through what many described as ruthless tactics, hostile takeovers, and an absolute refusal to show mercy to competitors or employees who couldn't meet his impossibly high standards. The media had dubbed him the Ice King after a particularly brutal corporate acquisition that left thousands of workers unemployed just before Christmas. His Manhattan penthouse office on the 47th floor overlooked a city that both respected and feared his influence, while his personal assistant kept a detailed schedule that allowed exactly 0 minutes for what he called emotional nonsense. Marcus had built his fortune by acquiring struggling companies, stripping them down to their profitable core operations, and selling off the rest without a second thought about the human cost. His philosophy was simple. Business was war, and in war only the strongest survived. Personal relationships were liabilities, charity was weakness, and sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He drove a black Bentley, wore custom Italian suits that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and lived alone in a 15,000-square-foot mansion in the Hamptons where he had never once entertained guests. The few employees brave enough to work directly with him knew that Marcus Blackstone's day began at 4:30 a.m. with workout routines that would challenge men half his age, followed by 16-hour workdays that crushed competitors and built his empire one calculated move at a time. His personal motto, framed in gold letters behind his desk, read, "Sentiment is the enemy of success." Chapter 2. The Unexpected Encounter. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, Marcus was returning from a particularly satisfying business meeting where he had just finalized the acquisition of a struggling tech company that would add another $200 million to his portfolio. As his Bentley pulled through the electronic gates of his Hamptons estate, he noticed something unusual that immediately irritated him. A woman was sitting on the stone steps just outside his property line, holding what appeared to be a young child and crying with the kind of desperate, broken sobs that suggested complete hopelessness. Marcus's first instinct was to call security and have the woman removed immediately. Homeless people, solicitors, and various other undesirables occasionally found their way to his exclusive neighborhood, and he had standing orders with local police to handle such situations swiftly and quietly. However, something about this particular scene made him pause. The woman wasn't dressed like a typical vagrant. Her clothes were clean but worn, suggesting someone who was struggling financially but still maintaining dignity. The child in her arms appeared to be around 3 years old, bundled in a coat that was too thin for the harsh November weather. As Marcus sat in his warm Bentley, watching through tinted windows, he found himself uncharacteristically curious about what could have driven this woman to his gates in such obvious distress. His chauffeur, James, had worked for Marcus for 8 years and knew better than to speak unless spoken to, but even he seemed affected by the sight of the crying mother and child. When the child looked directly at his car and waved, an innocent gesture that somehow penetrated the emotional armor Marcus had spent decades constructing, he heard himself saying words he had never spoken before. "Wait, let me see what this is about." Chapter 3. The Desperate Plea. Against every instinct and principle that had guided his life for the past 30 years, Marcus found himself stepping out of his Bentley and approaching the woman who was crying at his gates. As he drew closer, he could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of exhausted expression that comes from weeks of sleepless nights and constant worry. The child in her arms was indeed around 3 years old, a little boy with bright blue eyes who seemed remarkably calm despite his mother's obvious distress. When the woman looked up and saw Marcus approaching, her expression shifted from despair to something approaching terror. She clearly recognized him, though whether from newspaper photos or television interviews, Marcus couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," she stammered, attempting to stand while still holding her child. "I know I'm not supposed to be here. I didn't know where else to go." Marcus found himself studying her face with the same analytical intensity he applied to business deals. She had the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that suggested someone who had been fighting an impossible battle for far too long. Her hands were shaking, but whether from cold fear or desperation he couldn't determine. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the same cold efficiency he used in boardrooms. The question seemed to break something inside the woman, and she began crying harder. "My name is Sarah Chen," she managed between sobs. "This is my son, David. He's sick, very sick, and I've tried everything, but the insurance won't cover the treatment he needs, and I've sold everything I own, and I've begged every charity in the state, but nobody can help us." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. She had come to ask him for money, despite knowing his reputation for ruthlessness and complete lack of charitable giving. Chapter 4. The Heartbreaking Truth. "Please," Sarah continued, her voice breaking with desperation that was painful to witness. "I know what people say about you. I know you don't help people like me. But David has acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and there's an experimental treatment in Boston that could save his life. But it costs $400,000, and our insurance calls it investigational, so they won't pay for it." She reached into her worn purse with trembling hands and pulled out a folder thick with medical documents, her desperation making her brave enough to approach one of America's most intimidating businessmen. "I have all the paperwork here. The doctors at Children's Hospital say David only has a few months without this treatment, but with it, he has an 85% chance of complete recovery. I've tried everything: fundraisers, online campaigns, loans, selling our house, our car, everything we owned. I've raised $47,000 in 8 months, but it's not even close to enough." Marcus found himself looking down at the child, who was now making soft babbling sounds and reaching toward the golden buttons on Marcus's expensive coat. The boy's skin had the pale, translucent quality that Marcus recognized from his own mother's final days decades ago, and despite his efforts to remain detached, he felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. "Why me?" Marcus asked, though his tone had softened almost imperceptibly. "Why come to my house instead of going through proper charitable channels?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and exhausted. "Do you think I haven't tried proper channels? I've applied to every foundation, every charity, every assistance program in the country. Some won't help because we make too much money. My husband works 2 jobs and I work part-time when David's well enough for daycare. Others won't help because we don't meet their specific criteria, or because leukemia isn't their focus, or because experimental treatments aren't covered by their guidelines. I've been told no by 127 different organizations. I counted." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice filled with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting bureaucracy while watching your child slowly die. Chapter 5. The Internal Battle. Marcus stood in the cold November air, feeling more confused and conflicted than he had in decades. Everything about this situation went against his fundamental business principles and the emotional detachment that had made him successful. He had built his fortune by making logical, calculated decisions based on profit margins and strategic advantage, not by responding to sob stories from desperate strangers. Yet something about Sarah Chen and her dying son was penetrating defenses he had thought were impregnable. The rational part of his mind was already formulating reasons to walk away. He didn't know these people. Their problems weren't his responsibility, and opening this door would inevitably lead to thousands of other desperate people showing up at his gates with similar requests. He had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to start giving away his money to every sad story that crossed his path. But as he looked at David, who was now making happy sounds and trying to grab Marcus's coat buttons with tiny hands that seemed impossibly fragile, Marcus found his analytical mind being overruled by something deeper and more primal. The child reminded him of his nephew Tommy, who had died of cancer at age 4, 25 years ago. Marcus had been building his first company at the time and had been too busy with important business meetings to visit Tommy in the hospital during his final weeks. That regret had haunted Marcus for decades, though he had buried it so deeply that he rarely allowed himself to think about it consciously. "The treatment you mentioned," Marcus said carefully, his voice betraying none of the internal turmoil he was experiencing. "This experimental therapy in Boston. Have you spoken directly with the doctors there?" Sarah nodded eagerly, sensing a shift in his tone that gave her the first glimmer of hope she had felt in months. "Dr. Jennifer Walsh at Dana-Farber. She's one of the leading pediatric oncologists in the country. She reviewed David's case personally and said he would be an ideal candidate for the trial, but the hospital requires full payment up front because the insurance companies won't commit to coverage." Chapter 6. The Impossible Decision. While Sarah fumbled through her paperwork to find Dr. Walsh's contact information, Marcus's mind was racing through calculations that had nothing to do with profit margins or business strategy. He was thinking about a 3-year-old boy who might die because his mother couldn't raise $400,000, about experimental treatments that could save lives but were denied by insurance companies focused on bottom lines, and about the kinds of decisions that revealed who someone really was beneath their public persona. When Sarah handed him a business card with Dr. Walsh's information, Marcus dialed the number without hesitation, making a choice that would change not only David's life, but his own, in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The conversation that followed was brief, but illuminating. Dr. Walsh confirmed everything Sarah had told him. David was indeed an ideal candidate for the experimental treatment. The success rates were encouraging, and the hospital policy required payment in advance for non-covered procedures. More importantly, Dr. Walsh mentioned that there were 12 other children in similar situations, families who had exhausted all other options and were now facing impossible choices between bankruptcy and watching their children die. After hanging up, Marcus looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. The silence stretched between them for what felt like hours, with only the sound of David's cheerful babbling and the distant traffic on the highway. Sarah was holding her breath, afraid that any word might break whatever spell had kept Marcus listening this long, instead of calling security to remove them from his property. "The treatment needs to start within 2 weeks, Marcus said finally, his voice giving away nothing about his intentions. Dr. Walsh said that waiting longer significantly reduces the effectiveness. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face again. "I know. That's why I was so desperate. I've been calling everyone I could think of, trying every last option, but..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge her complete defeat and her son's likely death sentence. Chapter 7. The Life-Changing Call. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone again, this time dialing his personal attorney with a decision that would shock everyone who knew him. "Richard," he said when the call connected, his voice carrying the same decisive tone that had closed billion-dollar deals, "I need you to set up an immediate wire transfer to Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, $400,000. Patient name is David Chen. Attending physician is Dr. Jennifer Walsh. I want it done today." The silence on the other end of the phone was longer than Marcus had ever experienced in 30 years of working with Richard Morrison, his trusted legal advisor. Sarah's reaction was even more dramatic. She nearly dropped David, who was still reaching happily for the shiny buttons on Marcus's coat, completely oblivious to the fact that his life had just been saved by one of the most powerful men in America. For several seconds, she seemed unable to process what she had just heard, as if the words were in a foreign language that her desperate mind couldn't translate. When the reality finally hit her, Sarah's legs gave out entirely, and she sank back onto the stone steps, clutching David while sobbing with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and disbelief that was overwhelming to witness. "I don't understand," she managed between sobs that shook her entire body. "Why? Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Marcus found himself without a good answer to her question. The logical explanations, tax deductions, public relations benefits, strategic philanthropy, all felt inadequate and somehow dishonest. The truth was that he didn't fully understand his own motivations, and that uncertainty was deeply unsettling for a man who had built his entire life on calculated decisions and predictable outcomes. "Doctor, Walsh mentioned 12 other children in similar situations," Marcus said, avoiding Sarah's question entirely while his mind raced ahead to implications he was only beginning to understand. "I want you to get me the contact information for all of their families." Chapter 8. The ripple effect begins. Sarah looked up at Marcus with confusion that matched his own bewilderment at what he was saying. "I don't understand. Why would you want to contact other families?" Marcus was asking himself the same question, but the answer came to him with surprising clarity, as if some part of his consciousness that had been dormant for decades was suddenly awakening. "Because if one child deserves a chance to live, then 12 children deserve the same chance. And if I can afford to save one life, then I can afford to save 12 lives." The words sounded strange coming from his own mouth, as if someone else was speaking through him. This wasn't the calculating businessman who had spent decades building an empire through ruthless efficiency. This was someone else entirely. Someone Marcus wasn't sure he recognized, but who felt more genuine than the person he had been for the past 30 years. "I'll need you to coordinate with my assistant," Marcus continued, already formulating a plan with the same strategic thinking he applied to business acquisitions, but directed toward an entirely different kind of outcome. "We're going to contact each family, verify their situations, and arrange payment for all the treatments. I want this done quickly and quietly." Within 48 hours of his encounter with Sarah Chen, Marcus Blackstone had authorized wire transfers totaling $4.8 million to cover experimental cancer treatments for 13 children whose families had exhausted all other options. The speed and scope of his decision shocked his own staff, particularly his personal assistant Rebecca, who had worked for Marcus for 12 years and had never seen him display anything resembling charitable impulses. Rebecca found herself coordinating with desperate families across the country, arranging hospital payments and managing logistics for what had spontaneously become the largest single act of medical philanthropy in Marcus's life. But the most significant change wasn't in Marcus's bank account, it was in Marcus himself. Chapter 9. The Personal Transformation. For the first time in decades, Marcus found himself genuinely interested in outcomes that had nothing to do with profit margins or strategic advantage. He called Dr. Walsh daily for updates on David's treatment, and he had similar conversations with oncologists in Seattle, Chicago, Atlanta, and 6 other cities where children were beginning experimental therapies funded by his unexpected generosity. The transformation was visible to everyone around him. though none of them could quite understand what had caused such a dramatic change in a man who had been utterly predictable in his ruthlessness for 3 decades. James, his chauffeur, noticed that Marcus had stopped checking emails during car rides and instead spent time looking out the window at the world passing by, sometimes even commenting on things he observed. Children playing in parks, families walking together, ordinary scenes of human connection that he had never seemed to notice before. Rebecca observed that he had started asking about her family and remembering personal details about her life that he had previously ignored completely, even going so far as to ask about her daughter's piano recital and her husband's recovery from knee surgery. Most surprisingly, Marcus had instructed his legal team to research other families facing similar medical crises, effectively seeking out opportunities to help rather than waiting for desperate people to find him. He had established a dedicated phone line and email address for medical emergency requests, staffed by a team whose only job was to evaluate and respond to families facing catastrophic healthcare costs. The media hadn't caught wind of the story yet, but Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots and realized that one of America's most notorious corporate raiders had quietly spent nearly $5 million saving the lives of children he had never met. The prospect of public attention made him uncomfortable, not because he was ashamed of his actions, but because he was still trying to understand what had motivated them and what they meant for the person he was becoming. And Chapter 10, The Media Firestorm. Despite Marcus's efforts to keep his medical philanthropy private, the story inevitably leaked to the media through a combination of hospital staff gossip and social media posts from grateful family members who couldn't contain their excitement about their children's miraculous recoveries. The first article appeared in the Boston Globe under the headline, "Ice King's Heart Melts. Billionaire Secretly Funds Life-Saving Treatments for 13 Children." Within hours, the story had been picked up by national news outlets, financial publications, and social media platforms, creating exactly the kind of public attention that Marcus had spent his career either cultivating carefully or avoiding entirely. The media coverage was unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. Instead of the usual focus on his business dealings, hostile takeovers, or controversial decisions, reporters were writing about his transformation from a ruthless corporate raider into an unexpected humanitarian. Financial analysts were scrambling to understand how this development might affect his business empire, while human interest journalists were seeking interviews with the families whose children had benefited from his generosity. Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of being portrayed as a hero rather than a villain, and the experience was both gratifying and deeply unsettling. Phone calls poured into his office from other wealthy individuals asking for advice about effective philanthropy, while his personal assistant fielded hundreds of requests from families facing similar medical crises. The volume of attention was overwhelming, but what surprised Marcus most was that he found himself genuinely moved by many of the stories he was hearing. Children with rare diseases, experimental treatments denied by insurance companies, families facing bankruptcy to save their children's lives. The scope of medical desperation in America was far greater than Marcus had ever realized, despite his wealth and supposed sophistication about the world. More significantly, he was beginning to understand that his wealth gave him not just the ability to help these families, but perhaps a responsibility to do so that he had been ignoring for decades. Chapter 11. The Corporate Revolution. The media attention surrounding Marcus's medical philanthropy had unexpected consequences for his business empire that went far beyond simple public relations benefits. Within weeks of the story breaking, Marcus began receiving emails and calls from employees throughout his various companies, sharing their own stories about family members facing medical crises, children with special needs, and other situations where financial assistance could make life-changing differences. For the first time in his career, Marcus was seeing his workforce not as human resources to be optimized for maximum efficiency, but as actual human beings with complex lives, real problems, and legitimate needs that extended far beyond their job performance and productivity metrics. This revelation led to Marcus implementing the most comprehensive employee assistance program in corporate America, including emergency medical funding, child care support, elder care assistance, and educational scholarships for employees' children. The changes didn't stop with employee benefits. Marcus began applying the same humanitarian thinking to his business acquisition strategy, shifting from his traditional approach of buying struggling companies and stripping them for parts to a new model focused on revitalizing businesses while preserving jobs and strengthening communities. His first experiment with this approach involved a small manufacturing company in Ohio that was facing bankruptcy due to rising healthcare costs for its aging workforce. Instead of his usual strategy of buying the company's assets and liquidating everything else for maximum profit, Marcus purchased the business with the explicit goal of making it profitable while maintaining all existing jobs and improving employee benefits. The financial media was baffled by this apparent departure from Marcus's proven business model, with some analysts questioning whether his emotional transformation was compromising his business judgment and potentially threatening the value of his entire empire. However, early results suggested that Marcus's new approach might be more profitable than his old methods, as employee loyalty and productivity increased dramatically when workers believed their employer genuinely cared about their welfare rather than viewing them as disposable resources. Chapter 12. The Family Visit. 6 months after David Chen's treatment began, Sarah called Marcus with news that would complete his transformation in ways he never could have anticipated. David was not only responding well to the experimental therapy, he was exceeding all expectations and was likely to make a complete recovery. Dr. Walsh had declared his case a textbook example of why experimental treatments deserved more support and funding from both government and private sources. To celebrate this milestone, Sarah asked if Marcus would like to visit their family at home for dinner, a simple invitation that represented something Marcus had never experienced. A purely social relationship with people who genuinely cared about him as a person rather than as a business contact or financial resource. Marcus accepted the invitation with surprising enthusiasm, though he had no idea what to expect from a casual family dinner in a middle-class suburban home. Sarah and her husband Michael lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in Queens, the kind of neighborhood where Marcus hadn't spent time since his own childhood in a working-class family before he had transformed himself into a corporate titan. The evening was a revelation for Marcus, who discovered the simple pleasures of home-cooked meals, family conversation, and playing with a healthy, energetic child who saw him not as a famous billionaire but as Uncle Marcus, a family friend who happened to be really good at making funny faces and reading bedtime stories with dramatic voices that made David giggle uncontrollably. During dinner, Marcus learned about Michael's work as a high school history teacher, Sarah's job as a part-time nurse, and their dreams of someday taking David to Disney World when he was old enough to remember the experience. The conversation was relaxed, genuine, and completely free of the strategic maneuvering that characterized every other social interaction in Marcus's life. For the first time in decades, Marcus felt like he was part of a real family, experiencing the kind of warmth and acceptance that he had forgotten was possible. When he left that evening, Marcus realized that the $400,000 he had spent on David's treatment had purchased something far more valuable than a successful medical outcome. It had bought him a connection to the kind of life he had sacrificed in his pursuit of wealth and power. Chapter 13. The Legacy Transformed. 1 year after that cold November morning, when Marcus first encountered Sarah Chen crying at his gates, his life had been transformed so completely that colleagues, employees, and business associates barely recognized the man who had once been known as the Ice King. Marcus had established the Blackstone Medical Foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million specifically focused on funding experimental treatments for children whose families couldn't afford life-saving care that was being denied by traditional insurance coverage. The foundation had already helped over 200 families and had partnerships with major medical centers across the country to identify and support promising treatments that were being unfairly categorized as investigational by profit-focused insurance companies. But the foundation was only the most visible part of Marcus's transformation. His business empire had evolved into something unprecedented in corporate America. A collection of profitable companies that prioritized employee welfare, community development, and social responsibility, while still maintaining the financial success that had always characterized Marcus's ventures. The Blackstone model was being studied by business schools and copied by other corporations that were discovering the profitability of treating employees as human beings rather than disposable resources. Marcus's personal life had changed even more dramatically. His mansion in the Hamptons had been converted into a retreat center for families dealing with childhood cancer, while Marcus himself had moved into a more modest home where he regularly hosted dinner parties for the dozens of families who had become part of his extended chosen family. David Chen, now a healthy 4-year-old, called Marcus Uncle Marcus and had taught him to play video games, build Lego castles, and appreciate the simple joy of reading bedtime stories to a child who looked forward to seeing him every week. The transformation wasn't just external. Marcus had discovered that his capacity for happiness and fulfillment was directly related to his impact on other people's lives, rather than the size of his bank account or the fear he could inspire in competitors. The ruthless businessman, who had once measured success solely in dollars and market dominance, had become someone who measured success in children's smiles, families reunited, and communities strengthened. As Marcus reflected on that November morning, when he had almost called security to remove a desperate mother from his gates, he realized that Sarah Chen had given him something far more valuable than he had given her. She had shown him who he could become when he chose compassion over calculation, humanity over profit, and love over fear.